This video is completely self-indulgent. I just want to talk about the games I played this year. Also, I love an arbitrary ranking, and I've been trying to make more different types of videos, and a ranking is definitely a change of pace from a video essay. I spent a bit of time thinking about a specific method of ranking, like how heavily different aspects will be weighed, like gameplay versus presentation versus story, but for the sake of not getting too convoluted, I'm just ranking based on my personal enjoyment. Also worth clarifying that these are the games I played during 2022, and they are not all necessarily games which were released this year. While there is a good portion of games which were released this year, by no means all of them are. And while I've completed most of the games I'm talking about here, if for whatever reason I stop playing after a considerable amount of time spent playing, I still think it's worth mentioning them here. There are a few games which escape the ranking for various reasons though. I didn't put enough time into Going Under and Cyberpunk 2077 to really justify placing them. With Going Under, I liked the presentation and what it was going for, but the gameplay was way too simplistic to be an engaging roguelite, at least with how far through I got, and the controls felt really janky playing on PC. While the story could have gone in an interesting direction, it was nowhere near enough to convince me to go past the opening hours. And I think I tried Cyberpunk 2077 at the wrong time. It was all just a bit much, with all the options which are just kind of thrown at you. The story also wasn't grabbing me at all, and while the gameplay was promising, I just wasn't agreeing with it in the opening hours. I also wanted more options for the customization of the character appearance. It's a pet peeve of mine when a game gives you a massive freedom of adjusting like brow depth, but then you only get about 20 different hair options. It isn't nearly as bad for Cyberpunk, but for a game advertised for its depth of character creation, I expected just a bit more. I think it's a lot more likely that I'm going to go back to Cyberpunk at some point than I am with Going Under, but probably not for a while. So then, what is actually the worst game I played this year? It somehow took me about 15 hours of Trials of Mana to realise that I wasn't enjoying myself. In reviews, I'd seen that the job system really makes the game better, and a few hours after unlocking this, the game hadn't gotten any better, at least for me, so I was ready to move on. The game is pretty well liked, so I feel kind of bad that I didn't end up liking it at all. There was something about the presentation which was just a little off, like the saturation was turned up a bit too high. The aesthetic reminded me of Dragon Quest XI, which is what led me to play the game in the first place, but it lacks any of the charm that game had, and I could say that the story was too simple, but Dragon Quest XI also proved that a simple story can be engaging, so I don't really think I can make that many excuses for it. Splitting an overarching narrative into 6 characters, 3 of which you actually play in one campaign, all with kind of basic and skin-deep gameplay, doesn't make for the most fun experience for me. The comparison to Dragon Quest XI is what drew me to play it, but also what ended up killing all enjoyment. Like in Dragon Quest XI, I would scour through each new area for details and to get as much out of each area possible, while in Trials of Mana, I would run through each soulless copy-paste settlement, trying to get to the marker which would get me through this game faster. And once I realised that I wasn't even that far through, I simply couldn't force myself to keep going. I'm sure that some defenders of the game would suggest that trying the story with a different selection of characters, since maybe they have a better story, but my issues with Trials of Mana were so fundamental that I just don't trust that this would work. This is the only game I can confidently say that I got very little enjoyment from. Some characters were kind of fun and the designs were nice enough, if not a bit derivative, but I would definitely go to any other better RPG than try this again. I got much further through Immortals Fenyx Rising than I did Trials of Mana, and unlike Trials of Mana, I enjoyed most of the time I put into it. It took a different approach after it graduated from the class of studying Breath of the Wild's blueprint compared to a game like Genshin Impact, and I found it refreshing. The movement mechanics were definitely my favourite part of the game, and getting around felt incredibly satisfying once everything was unlocked. The writing was pretty good, and while the story had a simple premise, it was enough to keep me going for a while. But very quickly the gameplay became so formulaic that I just couldn't fathom to keep playing. The core gameplay loop that you start in the early hours very rarely changes, and compared to a game like Breath of the Wild, which has a similar formula, the gameplay was just missing the refinement and the logic needed to keep it interesting, and all the window dressing surrounding it just lacked any charm. The world is desolate, and while Breath of the Wild injects areas full of life to look out for and to keep exploration rewarding, you quickly realize that this is not the case here. Immortals also shares Breath of the Wild's flaws and does nothing to make them any better, and somehow makes them worse. Like, one of the worst things about Breath of the Wild was constantly running into reskinned enemies, and this was the same here, only the AI of the enemies was a lot worse. And while the combat in Immortals had more depth than Breath of the Wild's, it also got tired fast. Also, having a character created would usually give a game points in my books, but the one here is honestly so limited I just wish they put the effort into actually designing a main character instead of the lackluster tools they give us to make one ourselves. The choice for the royalty-free aesthetic of ancient Greece could have worked, but after a while it just left me wanting an adaptation of this mythology which was more inspired. Running around the world and completing silly little open-world tasks to improve my stats kept me going for more than 20 hours, but similarly to Trials of Mana, I snapped after a while and realised it wasn't fun anymore, and I'm not going to keep playing this game if I'm not having fun. I guess what puts it above Trials of Mana is that this snap took a lot longer to happen, and before it I can say I was having more fun, just not enough fun to keep me going. If Genshin Impact had the fluidity of movement that Immortals had, then that would be a Breath of the Wild clone which can be taken seriously, but at least Genshin can turn its players into gambling addicts to keep them playing. Unfortunately for Immortals, they did not have the foresight to think of something like this. I promise this whole list won't all be negative comparisons, with Trials of Mana paling to Dragon Quest XI and Immortals being uninspired Breath of the Wild, but maybe that's why they both rank so low, and maybe I would have liked them more if I didn't have this comparison to make, but unfortunately for them, that is not the case. It feels harsh to put what is essentially a glorified tech demo this low, competing with full games, and it feels equally as harsh to put it above 2 actual full games, but the couple of hours I spent playing it were a lot of fun and had just enough depth for it to not feel like a demo. It was nice to have a little experience to see why buying a PS5 was worth it. I got mine because this is the first year they have been kind of accessible, and playing this was a nice way to exemplify that the upgrade is actually worth it. It does feel a little uncanny to play through though. Between demonstrating the unique qualities of a console and an actual game, there is only so much success you can have while doing them both. This is why the presentation being great really helps. The PlayStation theming was consistently charming, and even though I didn't grow up with PlayStation, spotting all the references was always fun. It was fun to play through all of it, but it did always feel like I should be playing a 3-minute burst or playing on a display in a game store, and you can kind of feel this when looking at how the game is structured. I can see myself going back and playing it every now and then, but I feel like if I forced myself to go back and 100% it and get everything and treat it like more of an actual game, that wouldn't really do the game any favours. Haven is an indie game through and through, and I think you can feel this at its best and its worst. The repetitive gameplay loop was pretty satisfying, but it runs into those crunchy moments which would have been ironed out if it was made by a bigger team, but then you consider that this isn't really a game which would have been made by a bigger team anyway. Playing Haven is more satisfying than I would say fun. Clearing out the map isn't even a requirement to complete the game, and while it was tedious at some points, clearing out the map just felt like something I couldn't not do. The combat was probably the least fun I had with the game, and while I understand why it was included, I wish they found a way around it or took a different approach. From what I've seen of other people who played Haven, the story is what led to the most actual enjoyment. Having 2 protagonists didn't actually integrate into the gameplay that much, and instead it is more of a theme for the story as a whole. The writing is great, and these are characters you believe in, and their relationship is actually fun to witness instead of being as shallow as a lot of other relationships you can see in other games. They are fun to follow, and they are why I enjoyed playing as much as I did. However, with me enjoying the story and the characters so much more than I did the gameplay, I do feel like I could have gotten an equally enjoyable experience through watching a playthrough instead of actually just playing it myself. The story was at least paced well, and knew when to finish without overstaying its welcome. I've seen some people have issues with the ending, and without spoiling anything, the option to play through the game as a same-sex couple, which was added this year, actually fixes some of the more existential questions left with the ending. Before Oli Oli World, I hadn't really played a skating game like this for more than a couple of minutes, so I was surprised at how much I enjoyed it. The fun visuals mixed well with a fluid gameplay which for the most part was satisfying to play. The game gets more and more satisfying to play the more mechanics they teach you, and this learning curve is done pretty well. The issue is with how long it lasts, and how long it lasts is most of the game. You will still be getting tutorials in some of the last levels of the game, and I just wish the way Oli Oli World chose to teach you how to play the game was more condensed. It works, but it takes so long. And with it taking so long and having so much depth, you are bound to forget certain mechanics, and with the game having such an unconventional control scheme, especially for a beginner, I definitely just struggled with remembering exactly how to play in certain sections. I loved the game the most when they would give you a maze of a level and essentially told you to get to the end however you want and rack up combos as creatively as possible. It was challenging, especially in later levels, but that was when I was having the most fun. But when I was told to do a trick in a certain part of a level with a mechanic I was taught 3 hours ago and I haven't used in the last 2 hours, I usually just rolled my eyes and tried to power through. By the time I actually finished a campaign, I was happy with the experience I had and I felt like I'd had my fill. But I wish I got more of the fun I had in the later levels earlier on when I was still spending my hours in the game's drawn out tutorials. This almost tempts me to go back for the DLC levels, but I don't particularly want to risk shelling out for levels which I likely don't remember how to play, and if I get shown another tutorial for this game I honestly might cry. So I love JoJo, but I almost didn't get All Stars Battle R because of how awful I am at fighting games. With the exclusion of Smash, I tend to be awful at stringing combos together and memorizing attacks. But I was working on my JoJo video right as it was being released and thought it would be good to play for footage, and I was pleasantly surprised. When it was announced, for some reason I convinced myself it was a re-release of Eyes of Heaven, which I'd already played, but of course, as the name implies, it's a re-release of All Stars Battle. I genuinely think having characters I like convinced me to start playing, and for a 2.5D fighter it was pretty accessible and I had fun playing it. Switching out the low effort story mode from the original to the all-star battle mode in this version made sense for me and I had fun playing through it, but once I was done there wasn't really much reason to go back. I wish the game had added a more interesting way to unlock bonuses than an arbitrary in-game currency, and at least one more gameplay mode would have given this game a lot more staying power. It's nice to have a more updated and accessible version of All-Star Battle, but I can't help but wish there was a little more meat on the bones. I'm probably going to play again when all the DLC has been released, and I'm impressed that I had fun playing a fighting game, but I don't see myself going back to it that often. The premise of World's End Club immediately convinced me to play. A survival game set up gone wrong, gone apocalyptic, bright aesthetic, twisted tone, side-scroller adventure through Japan. This is what convinced me to start playing, and it got me to the end, but not without some speed bumps. The setup was amazing, and the opening hour was one of the strongest, and while the story lulls at some points and having to do multiple playthroughs to get the true ending would usually put me off, the way this game pulls off its story in my eyes was a success, and getting to the true ending is well worth it. Most of the characters are likeable and there are none I dreaded spending time with, which is impressive for a cast of 12, so the story was great and I definitely recommend experiencing it however you can. Unfortunately, every other aspect of the game is somewhere between slightly flawed and crunchy. If you ignore the story, the gameplay would be irredeemable. This game did not need to be a platformer, and this is its biggest weakness. If the team who worked on this had never made a platformer before, I wouldn't be surprised. The movement is slow but slippy, and you can never grasp the sense of momentum properly to do anything specific. There is also a mechanic where each of the 12 characters unlocks a different power throughout the campaign to help you overcome obstacles, which is interesting but executed terribly. You never get free choice without exploration or with use of powers, so they are essentially just window dressing to help you complete levels, but not even really that significant. Since the game is so linear, there is no chance you could be far enough into a level where you need to use a power where you wouldn't have it, so essentially it's just another button to press when the game asks you to press it. And when this is so obvious, it starts to feel more and more tiring. The use of the powers never goes anywhere past a slight challenge and it just feels mind-numbing, especially in comparison to how well the story is done. The visuals also wildly vary in quality, like the character models look amazing and the closer you look at them the better they look, but some of the backgrounds and environments are laughably bad and draw attention. The lack of attention placed on these environments also killed any enjoyment I had in the road trip across Japan element of the game. Like, yeah, these are real places, but if they're essentially just names with an ugly background, then I'm not getting that sense of wonder I hoped for. The story was great and I'm happy I played it, but the process of playing it quite often felt like a chore. Like after every session I would be happy I got to see the story progress, but the gameplay I went through to get there really made me almost give up a few times. Even more so than Haven, if there was any game I would recommend watching a playthrough of, it would be this. The same team are working on another game called Raincode, which is coming out next spring, and this looks like it leans into the story aspect a bit more heavily, so thank God they're not trying a platformer again. So I'm hoping this will be a step up from whatever World's End Club was attempting. Out of every Bayonetta game I've played, this is the one I expected to like the most. I went into Bayonetta 1 pretty neutral. I wasn't great at it, so I was surprised when I liked the gameplay of Bayonetta 2 a lot more. So this led me to be a lot more excited about the next installment in what I saw was an upwards trajectory. I tried to stay away from trailers and pre-release news, with the exception of the September 2021 trailer, which made me write my first video, so I could go in as blind as possible. With the massive media hype surrounding the game fueled by marketing genius Helena Taylor, I did manage to get a little spoiled, like Bayonetta's relationship status, the multiverse plotline, people not liking Viola's gameplay, and the general mixed reception. And my reaction to the game mirrored that. It was mixed. Very mixed, and it was a pretty polarizing experience to play. The core gameplay was, to me, the best in the series. Controlling and fighting as Bayonetta felt like a dream, and the way summoning demons was incorporated into combat felt fluid and rewarding, for the most part. The weapons and the weapon forms were a fun idea, and this is a level of gameplay diversity I had wished for in other entries, but that wasn't it, and we kept getting more and more different styles of gameplay thrown in. On top of the core Bayonetta gameplay, there are the Gene levels, which are short and sweet and don't overstay their welcome, but the Viola levels drag. I tried to like them and the first time wasn't too bad, but the amount of time you are forced to play as this clunky character is overbearing and usually kills the momentum the game had built up. And on top of this, we regularly get sections in Bayonetta levels where the gameplay is forced into a demon controlling section, and these all feel pretty awful, and even if they don't last that long, I nearly always wanted them to be over as soon as they began. The kaiju demon sections weren't as bad, and the spectacle tended to overshadow any potential gameplay weaknesses, but the medium-sized demon sections, like sliding over buildings with the dog, or flying through ruins with a bird, or the godforsaken tarantula platforming, were all clunky and headache-inducing. I get that being a bit incohesive is a natural part of a multiverse narrative, but with how much the gameplay tried, I really wish they stuck a little closer to what works and what is fun. On the topic of the multiverse narrative, in my perspective, the story is probably the weakest of the series. With how much it was jumping around and how little explanation there were for some scenes, a lot of the emotional beats just didn't hit how I think they were designed to, and it just never hit its stride, but somehow still managed to feel formulaic. Now, I don't know if this is because you're supposed to be reading all the books you pick up, or if I missed story cutscenes somehow, or if it was teasing the upcoming prequel game, but as I experienced Bayonetta 3's narrative, it wasn't a very satisfying product to get through. I have some more specific nitpicks, like the new enemy designs being kind of uninspired, especially compared to the high bar set up by earlier entries, or just how the characters are treated like earlier entries don't exist, but I'll save it, because I did enjoy this game, but I can't help but mourn all of its wasted potential. This quite easily could have been the best in the series, and while I usually commend trying new things to spice up a series, especially when looking at the snail's pace for innovation in franchises like Pokemon, it was all just a bit much and detracted from the final product. I think I'll enjoy it a lot more upon a replay or going into random chapters I enjoyed, but I do want to talk about this game and series some more. I'm planning to go more in depth on the third game in a follow-up to my first ever video, so if you want my thoughts on Bayonetta 3 in a perhaps more nuanced setting, look forward to that. I wasn't going to include Monster Hunter Rise since I only started it quite recently, and I don't think I finished it. Like, technically I've reached credits, but there is still so much more content to go through. The story is still continuing, there's monsters I haven't fought, I still want to upgrade my armor and weapon more. There's simply too much left to just walk away from it. This is only the second mainline Monster Hunter game I've actually played, with the last being Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate for the 3DS, which I had fun with and got pretty addicted to, but didn't actually finish. I had fun with it playing with a heavy bowgun, but I remember finding it a bit awkward with some of the quirks of the series which have now actually been ironed out. I'm sure there are purists who see these refinements as detracting from the essence of the series, but with how much time they save and how much more fun I'm having, I'm happy that the changes have been made. Even though I'm only playing Monster Hunter Rise a sad way, or more specifically, single player, it is still plenty of fun. The addition of the palmoots and the wire bugs make traversal a lot more fun. Playing with a hunting horn is a nice change from before. The game, of course, looks better than my last experience, but compared with some recent Switch games, it's especially impressive. It also has a great character creator, which I appreciated, even if maybe a little bit too much is locked behind DLC. I'm just having a great time working through it, with the exclusion of rampages feeling like a bit of a chore, but other than that, it's great. I can feel myself maybe getting a bit tired of the repetitive nature of the game, and I am missing the multiple hub towns and greater variety of maps from 4 Ultimate. Because of this, and the fact that I really can't say it's a complete experience yet, I don't want to place it too much higher. Kirby and the Forgotten Land is a very good game, and while I don't follow the Kirby franchise that closely, I do know that this was a shake-up to the formula which was needed. A shake-up which persuaded me to play, but what really got me to follow through was when the multiplayer trailer was shown off and me and Jay, the voiceover helper from my previous videos, decided to play through together. While we did have fun, this is where a lot of the issues and cracks in Kirby and the Forgotten Land shows. Adding a bonus mode like a multiplayer option seems like it will always be a good thing, but with a game like Kirby which is so linear, it becomes very clear that the game was not designed with this option in mind. The design and the world of Kirby and the Forgotten Land is brought to life partially through the use of very specific and controlled third-person camera angles, precise camera angles which do not have a second player in mind. If you want to have a second-class citizen simulator, I recommend playing as Waddle Dee in Kirby and the Forgotten Land. Luckily, we switched who played as Kirby by level, but running around watching the other player be focused on by the camera and getting all the fun different powers while you play catch up using the same repetitive spear combos gets boring fast. It was a very fun game to play through, and even though there were issues with the multiplayer, it was still playable. There was a lot of bonus and post-game content which I still haven't touched since finishing the game. I want to play it, but I can't help but think my initial experience with the game was soured by an option which is included and offered by the creators of the game, but ends up feeling like a slightly clunky fan-made mod. I don't think I have much to say about Stray which hasn't already been said, especially in terms of praise. It's a great game, and in my opinion it's a perfect length for a game of its style. It has a charming story, and for a game which is played in a relatively unconventional style, it controls well. Compared to Kirby, which was held back by the multiplayer option, playing Stray with a friend through taking turns at player-decided intervals was a fun way to get through it. Since the game is so precisely designed with such a small and curated world, it can get pretty tiring to play since you do not want to miss anything. So, having someone to take over when you get a little tired and then you can help each other with details you might miss feels pretty optimal. It's worth pointing out that these free roaming exploration sections are where Stray shines, but when it is in more restricted sections, this is where you notice some of the flaws of the game's design, but these are pretty easy to overlook. When it comes to the flaws of the game, it got a bit of criticism for borrowing heavily from the techno-orientalist aesthetic, but these critiques were very quickly washed out by defenders calling these critics chronically online, and going with the approach of, well, how can the cat game be racist? It was kind of a shame to see people be so unwilling to listen to criticism for something they enjoy, since it wasn't coming from a place of, if you like this you're awful, and it was coming from more of an educational, this design choice has some problematic roots. This aspect of Stray is definitely worth researching instead of retreating into your turtle shell when someone critiques an aspect of a game you might like. In spite of this, Stray is still a great game and fun and worth playing, but that doesn't mean I have to pretend that it's perfect. I've technically been playing bits and pieces of Super Mario 3D World since it was originally released almost a decade ago. Whether this was demoing it in a game store or playing someone else's copy, but it took until me picking it up last year and actually playing it earlier this year with Jay to finish it. I'm sure I'm probably the first person to say this since 2013, but Super Mario 3D World is actually a good game. It's polished and it's designed to play with multiplayer in mind, which really sticks out in retrospect after playing a game like Kirby. The only place its multiplayer cracks do show is in post-game, where the more precise levels would probably be a bit less frustrating for one player, but that's a sacrifice for a difficulty increase. It is a shame that the multiplayer-focused approach led to Nintendo losing a bit of the inspiration which is so present in the Galaxy duology which preceded it, and Odyssey which has made since it. It ends up with 3D World feeling just a little bit forgettable. This is why I'm looking forward to going back and playing through the Bowser's Fury campaign, since it seems like it just has a bit more going on. When it comes to their placement, Super Mario 3D World and Stray feel pretty interchangeable, but the reason why Stray is just below is because I feel like I'm going to return to Super Mario 3D World a lot sooner, with the replay value nudging it just a bit higher. Ending and now winning the competition of the 4 games I played multiplayer this year is It Takes Two. Hazelight seems to almost exclusively make games with multiplayer in mind, so it's no surprise that their most recent effort was so successful. It is impressive how the gameplay in It Takes Two evolves and changes so frequently without losing momentum. I don't think people compare It Takes Two to Bayonetta 3 that often, but it's so interesting to see how It Takes Two seamlessly adds gimmicks without them feeling unnatural, while this ended up kind of killing Bayonetta 3 for me. It's kind of impressive to see how it could have gone wrong, and they managed to do all of this while still keeping multiplayer in mind. It's also amazing to see how It Takes Two looks with the aesthetic shifting so often. Luckily I played it on PS5 right before it was released for Switch, but I can see Switch players probably not getting the best experience. So, while the gameplay and presentation were close to perfect, I do take issue with the narrative and the pacing. While I mention the pacing, I'm mainly referring to the length of the levels. While I don't need all levels to match perfectly in length, the first level of It Takes Two was, for me, the perfect length, but from this point levels keep getting longer and longer with very quick ones occasionally thrown in. It wasn't a massive issue, but it had me wishing that some levels would just up and finish a bit quicker. Also, when playing with 2 people, giving more obvious points for breaks is important, since you can't trust 2 people to have the same level of patience to keep playing at the same time. There's only so much I can mention about the story without delving into spoilers, but watching the lead couple chat was occasionally charming, but their inability to communicate with each other was nearly always frustrating to listen to. This partially contributed to the conclusion of the game feeling pretty unsatisfying and a bit rushed, but at least the journey to get there was worth it. Solar Ash is the most recent game I actually finished, and it was refreshing to just quickly complete a whole game over the course of a couple days. The gameplay ended up feeling like a much more fluid version of what Haven was going for, and instead of grinding gameplay to a halt for combat, it was integrated into how you interact with the environment. The world design also ended up feeling a bit more intentional, and it was clear it was just more refined in almost every aspect. Gliding around the world of Solar Ash just felt more responsive and satisfying, and that just led to a more enjoyable experience overall. It wasn't a conscious decision, but I barely paid any attention to the narrative in Solar Ash, especially when it came to the side objectives and the reading logs. I did pay some attention to the interactions between Ray and Echo, and the payoff to that was rewarding, but for how it helped the pacing, I don't regret ignoring what most of the other characters were saying. Overall, even though I've completed the roughly 4.5-hour story, I could see myself going back to just spend time moving around the map and picking up some bits which I missed. I'm also relieved that I played this after Haven, because if I didn't, I probably would have spent a lot of the time getting through the gameplay in Haven wishing I was just playing Solar Ash instead. Playing Ori and the Blind Forest really helped solidify the Metroidvania games as some of my favourite to play. I tend to play about one a year and I always get sunk in and love them. Whether it was Hollow Knight a couple of years ago, Bloodstained last year, each time I play one I realise how fun the genre is. So even while Ori is probably my least favourite of these three, I had a great time playing it. The presentation of this game is amazing, but I don't think I need to tell you that. I think anyone who sees even a few seconds of gameplay wants to spend time in this world. What held back Ori from overtaking other Metroidvanias I've played is also one of its biggest strengths, being its length. The progression, which is so core to a Metroidvania, never really went as far as it usually would, with the game only taking a few hours to complete. But this is also why I liked it. I'll always prefer a short and simple game which is packed with intentional design decisions, than a game which seems massive if you squint, but is instead just bloated with mindless content. This is why I'm hesitantly looking forward to playing Ori's sequel eventually. The only thing I really know about it is that it's longer, so hopefully it builds up on what was set up in the first game instead of stretching it out to just make a longer game. Another thing which kind of impacted my enjoyment of Ori is how much people bigged up the emotional impact of the game. Like, yeah, it's emotional, but for how much I expected, the story just didn't hit as hard as people made it out to. I think there's a bit of an expectation that beautiful games like this will always have an equally as beautiful story, but that doesn't always have to be the case and can lead to some mismatched expectations. I played Horizon Zero Dawn a few years ago, and while I enjoyed it for a bit, it felt like it was missing something and I dropped it after about 20 hours. And that made me hesitant to try Horizon Forbidden West, but it was bundled with the PS5 I was getting and it looked like it would at least show off the console's capabilities. Luckily, it fixed almost all of my issues with its predecessor. Even though I had to catch up with the story of the first game through YouTube summaries, I got more attached to the story and the characters this time, and the setting just connected with me more. The action felt more responsive, as did getting around the world. Adding a glider should honestly just be the standard at this point. The world felt more vibrant, more lived in, and this is probably helped by the PS5, but a better visual direction as well, since it generally just looked a lot better. I was honestly having one of the best times I'd had with an open world game since probably Breath of the Wild. After about 25 hours, I was fully invested with the story, which is just starting to properly ramp up and give Aloy more freedom with the direction of the narrative. So, I had just gotten to Stonecrest and finished my session, and when I picked up the game later that day, my save had corrupted. I don't know how, it might have been due to an update, maybe I saved wrong, but after wrangling with error codes and forums, I had to abandon the save, and eventually managed to get the game refunded. It was honestly the biggest case of gaming blue balls I had since Animal Crossing Amiibo Festival was announced, and it still stings over half a year later. I will go back to Forbidden West one day, but starting from the beginning after getting so deep in would have been torture. Maybe I could recover my save, but I doubt it. I had a great time while it lasted, and I think being this high in spite of me getting cut off halfway through is a testament to how much fun I was having, but because of the pure frustration I experienced, I don't think I can put it any higher. Playing through 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim was a constant experience of being impressed at how well a video game story could be told out of order. It really puts Trials of Mana to shame, which cannot make 6 characters' narratives have any impact on each other or be engaging, while playing the story of any of the 13 protagonists was not only interesting, but impactful on other characters' stories as well. Of course, some characters' stories were more engaging, and some of the characters were more likable, but I was never checked out of any of the characters' narratives, and each story had twists and reveals which made me never want to stop paying attention. A lot of reviews I saw before playing got me worried about the strategy sections of the game, but honestly I enjoyed it every time. The only time it got frustrating, at least on standard difficulty, was the insane difficulty spike for the final level. Every now and then I get traumatized by a final boss difficulty spike, and I hadn't experienced one in a while, but 13 Sentinels reminded me that this is always a possibility. Outside of the strategy game element, the rest of the gameplay was pretty easy. Sometimes you can get stuck in annoying loops when exploring and need to reset, but after getting the hang of it, this is pretty easy to avoid. The story does have options to look at recaps and timelines, and while I never remembered everything in detail, I didn't need to for the story to be impactful. And this isn't because of binging the game. I played over the course of a few weeks, so I think this is a bit of a testament to the quality of the storytelling. Even though, in retrospect, I can say I enjoyed the story, the direction it was going closer to the end was getting a bit more frustrating. It seemed like at some point the game decided which characters you're supposed to care about the most, and that's pretty annoying. So, while I had different hopes for the ending, it wasn't offensive. But the journey to get there was definitely worth more to me. While I raved about the atmosphere of Stray and how much it contributed to the game's quality, Paradise Killer's unique atmosphere made this one of the most memorable and engaging experiences I've had with a game in recent years. I'm not even that big on the vaporwave aesthetic, but the way Paradise Killer utilized it makes a game which has a rich ambiance that exceeds the sum of its parts tenfold astounds me. This is essentially a visual novel style detective investigation narrative which is spread over an open world which is designed to be explored however you want to. You can go around however you want, finding different details which all contribute towards a strong world building. You're not given much before going in, and the story shouldn't work with how practically nothing is based in our version of reality, but the island and what you discover makes it believable. Some of the characters are likeable, others are not, but they are all interesting and have depth which it is your job to uncover. Sometimes, especially in games, learning about characters can be a chore and feels disconnected from what you're supposed to be doing, but the writing in Paradise Killer ensures that you're motivated and interested throughout its roughly 12-hour narrative. Paradise Killer is such an indie game, and has all the quirks and design sensibilities of one, especially when it comes to repeating voice lines, but its limitations contribute to a more cohesive and engaging experience which not a lot of other indie games seem to grasp. Like, it could have been made to look more polished or refined if made by a bigger team or budget, but after finishing the whole game I feel like something like that would just take away from the whole experience. I know this style won't be for everyone. When I showed it to some friends while playing through, there were of course comments asking if it's supposed to look like that, but I honestly don't think it will make sense until you're exploring and investing yourself. Not for everyone, but if you're looking for an unconventional narrative in a 2000s style which is something clearly a product of a team with a vision, then I heavily recommend Paradise Killer. So Metroid Dread was my first serious attempt to get through a 2D Metroid game. I tried the 3DS ports of Metroid and Metroid Fusion when I was way too young to really know what I was doing. However, I came to Metroid Dread with a much better mindset. I now played and loved plenty of Metroidvanias like the aforementioned Bloodstained, Hollow Knight and Ori and the Blind Forest, so now it's time to actually play the series which pioneered the template which these all follow. It's safe to say I had a good time with it. I would say Metroid Dread now matches Hollow Knight as my favourite Metroidvania, and the main reason for this is the smoothness of the gameplay. The polish and the freedom which this game offers is why I essentially devoured it over the course of a week, and while I'm sure I would have kept playing if there was more, I would say the game is a perfect length. It's not too long that I would be discouraged from replaying or re-entering the save to pick up some missing pieces, but not too short to feel unsubstantial. Like a lot of the games I like, which are as well regarded as Metroid Dread is, there is not much praise I can give the game which is original, so I'm not going to waste time repeating everything the litany of glowing reviews for this game have said more efficiently than I can. While Metroid Dread should really encourage me to want to go back and try some older entries in the series, I'm instead going to hold back since I'm a little worried Dread might have set the bar a little too high. Also, Hollow Knight Silksong should be releasing next year, and I want to save my Metroidvania energy for 2023 all for that. Similarly to Metroid Dread, there is not much positive I can say about Hades which has not already been said. I held back from playing Hades for so long since I'd already spent a significant amount of time watching two friends play through it since it was released. I thought that since I'd seen plenty of major events in the game and witnessed hours of gameplay, there was simply no reason to play it myself. But when I saw the physical edition on sale and Zagreus was glistening on the cover, I really couldn't resist. I very quickly learned that while watching someone play Hades is one thing, actually playing the game and controlling the insanely addictive feedback loop yourself is where the real appeal is. It's kind of the opposite of games like Haven or World's End Club, where you could kind of get the same or even a better experience watching someone play it rather than playing it yourself. You have to play Hades to understand why people like it so much. I also don't think I'm a fan of roguelites as a genre, as evidenced by my lack of patience for going under, which is all the more reason why I found Hades' ability to keep me engaged so astounding. The process of playing through the content in Hades was so rewarding that it's the only game this year which I actually got a platinum for, and even when that was done I easily could have kept playing. This is what I think separates the top games on this list from the rest of them. Even with Metroid, when I was done I was ready to move on, but with Hades and the next game I could have easily kept going in spite of the above average playtime. And this isn't me saying Hades is perfect. While I had a great time unlocking different things throughout the game, I couldn't help but wish there was a bit more depth to the unlocks. This is kind of reflected in the character arcs as well. While some characters get pretty good development, I wish that others got a bit more time to themselves. Even with the romance options, while this aspect is engaging, it also wasn't particularly rewarding, with very little in the way of evidence that you'd done this content. The art in Hades is amazing, but I can't help but wish we got a little more, whether it is visual novel style artwork for maxing out relationships, or just more fanfare for reaching these milestones, like a unique piece of artwork for maxing out a relationship with a god, or for beating a certain boss for the first time. Also, kind of on this note, a pet peeve of mine is that there's an amazing animated trailer for Hades, which I kind of thought would be like an introduction to the game or something when you load it up, and it's just not in the game at all. There's no way of watching it to my knowledge. The slightly lacking content is also reflected in the epilogue, which is meaty, but again, you don't get much of a reward for completing it, and the reward you do get feels a bit unsubstantial. But in spite of all these critiques, I would happily go back to Hades. While some of the bonus aspects of the game are lacking, it's impossible to fault the actual gameplay itself. It feels pretty behind the times to say this, but 2 years post-release and finally playing one of my many hoarded PS Plus games, I can now say that Final Fantasy VII Remake was my favourite game of 2022. It's kind of weird that while I know that the original Final Fantasy VII and the remake are both highly acclaimed games, I went in with pretty low expectations. I knew the game had a pretty dark and grimy aesthetic, with Midgar being the only location, and I wasn't very familiar with any of the characters, and from what I'd seen of Cloud, he wasn't particularly appealing, at least to me. I also knew that the gameplay was similar to that of Final Fantasy XV, which was fun but not super deep. Not only that, but I was also wary of playing a game which was just a part 1 and not technically a complete story, but every potentially negative expectation I had ended up being disproven and then some. I don't know why it was such a surprise, but the amount of personality which is packed into the campaign of this story is staggering. I didn't really expect to like Cloud or any of the party that much, but their characterization throughout the story makes them all not just likable, but believable. I now get why people love Cloud. The portal he opened of gruff, quiet protagonists should have been closed behind him, since none of the copycats seem to really understand why his character works so well. And it was not just the main cast which I loved, but the side characters as well. There is no competition for my favourite game character of the year. Whoever designed Roche deserves the world. A pompadour mullet with an obnoxious, flamboyant personality is essentially in the middle of my Venn diagram for a character I will love. His figure is pre-ordered, and I will be rioting if he doesn't feature more in the next part. I know he cameos in the DLC, so I'm looking forward to playing that next year as well. Moving away from the Roche appreciation rant, the world design of Final Fantasy VII Remake really made me rethink my approach to the games I play. Going in, I just assumed it would be an open world, since that's the case for most RPGs, and it was for Final Fantasy XV, but the fact it wasn't an open world was so refreshing. It just means that the areas which are included are just so much more detailed and full of life. And while I actually loved my time with Final Fantasy XV, being the only Final Fantasy I had previously played all the way through, the world had so much empty space which simply had no reason to be there, so seeing such intentional game design meant that every part of the world was memorable. Playing these games in this order is so interesting, since 15 was a mainline entry and this is just a remake. It really feels like 15 was a foundational experiment done, which meant 7 Remake could succeed so spectacularly. And I haven't even mentioned the gameplay. Most critics have spoken on it much more eloquently than I can, but I was surprised at how much fun it was building on the rough blueprints set up in 15 and refining it to just have a bit more going on. I was worried with this being the first part of the remake series that the gameplay would be a bit limited, but this was not the case. 7 Remake just seems to get what makes a good game. It strikes a balance of the perfect amount of content to do. There are some optional side objectives which are engaging enough to give you reason to do them, but you are not pressured to, and this adaptability means you can essentially spend as much time with 7 Remake as you want to. This means the game is not bloated and feels like a treat to play as opposed to a chore. While there are games on this list, even some which are quite high up, which I can say I enjoy, sometimes I found myself playing them out of a sense of completionist obligation rather than fun. So even if I ended up having fun usually when I played these games, I never had to force myself to play 7 Remake. And while I probably ended up getting a bit more addicted to Hades and playing longer sessions, the time I spent playing through Final Fantasy VII Remake just ended up feeling of a higher quality. Not to shit on Hades since it was made by such a smaller team, but I do feel the need to explain my reasoning for placing them in this order. I can also confidently say I've overcome any recency bias. I played this pretty early in the year before I got my PS5, and honestly I could just replay it to appreciate the game in a higher quality, but honestly I'm not starved for content. I haven't played the Integrate DLC yet, and Crisis Core Reunion just came out, and then the second part of the remake is slated for release later in the year, but we'll see if that happens. So hopefully I can spend next year enjoying Final Fantasy just as much as I did this year, but that is a very high bar to overcome. So, while these are all the main games which I played this year which I want to rank, I also want to quickly talk about the games as a service type games which I've been playing for the past year as well. While these games serve a purpose and they can be fun, I don't think it's a coincidence that the people who talk about gaming dying and modern gaming being dead are the same people who exclusively play live games like these. So with the preaching out of the way, let's look at 2 embarrassing time sinks I can't help but go back to. I've been pretty heavily invested into Genshin since 1.2 back in late 2020, and it's kind of wild to see how far it's come and how different it is since it first launched. In spite of all the constant changes and updates, this is probably the year I experienced the most burnout. But all that's done is really help me realise that stuff like that will just always come in waves. The main burnout mainly came before Sumeru was released in summer, but once it was out that really did inject some life back into it. While what we've seen as Sumeru isn't perfect, especially with the choice in character designs, it's good to see that the gameplay, world design and storytelling has improved in most areas. I'm not going to rant about Genshin for too long since I don't want to go on, but I'm probably going to make a video about it sometime later anyway. But this year I pulled for Xiao on his rerun, Ayato and his weapon, then C1 Xiao, Tainari, Sino, and most recently Scaramouche and his weapon, because homosexuality is incurable. The antithesis of my gayness is encapsulated in the embarrassing amount of hours I have put into Fortnite. At least I almost exclusively play it socially, so that's one thing, but I still see playing it as a character flaw. In spite of all that, the changes made with Chapter 3 this year have made the game significantly more fun. I was never a fan of building, so having no build as an option feels like it should have never been missing, and the new movement options make the game feel a lot more fluid and fun to move around in. I actually wish movement changes like this could be given to Genshin to maybe get rid of a little bit of its stiffness, but I honestly don't see this happening anytime soon. The new Chapter 4 seems promising, but it's too early to really comment on it, but that is as much as I'm going to say on Fortnite, as I feel like every word I speak on it dwindles more of my already limited credibility. But that's everything I played in 2022. I mean, I might get Splatoon 3 during the festive season, but at the time of writing, that's everything. Looking over the list, I'm happy that I liked so many of them. I ranked 21 games and I liked 19 of them, and that's a great portion. More than 90%, that's impressive. I'm happy with my choices. I'm also going into 2023 pretty hopeful. I mean, I felt the same about this year with upcoming releases, but I didn't really end up playing any big new games except Bayonetta and Horizon, and even then, I wasn't there on release day. And of course, the Breath of the Wild sequel was supposed to be out this year, but now we have a 2023 release date, so I have something much more solid to look forward to. And also, the next Final Fantasy remake with Rebirth is supposedly releasing in winter, so I won't be surprised if one of those ends up being the best next year. So even though I have plenty to look forward to, I still want to try a bunch of new stuff as well. Like now I've overcome my distaste toward fighting games, I might try and give them a bit more of a chance. And just generally, I have so many random games like stuff on PS Plus and random indies on Switch which I want to try. So hopefully one of these will end up surprising me as much as something like Paradise Killer did. Next year will probably be a bit too soon for me to return to Horizon Forbidden West, especially if I can't recover my save, but maybe one day I'll end up finishing a Horizon game, who knows. Also, since I literally just got the Nintendo Online expansion pack for the combined reason of Splatoon and the Mario Kart courses, I now by happenstance have the Animal Crossing DLC. I don't think I'm the only one who thinks Nintendo kind of fumbled New Horizons after such a strong launch with such lackluster support, and then too little, too late. But free DLC will likely motivate me to return to what I'm sure is my graveyard of an island. But in spite of some issues like Bayonetta 3 maybe not going in the direction I would have hoped, Zelda getting delayed and my personal Horizon save corruption tragedy, overall 2022 has had some of the best games I've played recently. So hopefully I can carry the attitude of just trying a bigger variety into the next year and hopefully surprise myself again with how much I end up enjoying it. If you've made it this far, thank you. I don't usually make videos like this and I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. I usually make video essays about gaming and anime, and while I love those, this was really fun to make, so if I ever think of anything else to rank, I'll probably do it. But if you're interested in those video essays, or you just want to see more from me, subscribing would be amazing. But yeah, I have some people to thank, just Jay and Annie for helping me with the script. It wasn't as, like usually with a video essay, there's a lot more to go through, but with this, it was just a bit easier, so yeah, that was nice. But yeah, no, my outros are usually really long and rambly, because I usually have loads of like amendments to make to the video, just like, oh, I forgot to do this. But no, with this one, the only thing I really thought when I was going through editing it was like, oh, I might be a bit harsh in this. I don't know. If you like any of the games I dislike, obviously that's nothing against you or your taste. But no, to be fair, that's the thing. I only dislike 2 of them. If you're a massive Immortals, Phoenix Rising, or Trials of Mana fan, I'm very sorry. But we have a different taste, obviously. And also with some of them in the middle, I think the positions could change, especially some of the multiplayer games. I was kind of like, oh, but I really like every time I kind of went to like record, I was like, oh, should I shift this? And eventually I was just like, no, I'll just keep them in the same place. But yeah, the only one which shifted drastically was Monster Hunter Rise, because I obviously wrote it quite last minute, and I was just like, I got over some of my recency bias, and I was like, I have to put it down a bit lower. It was originally 9th, and I was like, 13th. But yeah, if you like this, I hope you check out some of my other stuff, but even if you didn't, thank you for watching.